Hello. Thank you so much, Rupal, for being here. I'm here with Rupal Patel, and we're going to talk about all things leadership, particularly at the moment, a really important topic. And particularly, we're going to talk about your book, From CIA to CEO Unconventional Life Lessons for Thinking Bigger, Leading Better, and Being Bolder. So let's get right into it. And the first question I wanted to ask you was really about something that you talk about in your book. You talk about mission, and I really am interested to understand, how did you get here? And what was your mission? And are you on mission?
Yeah. Well, it's a big question. And I think one of those things that I don't think we often enough give ourselves the time to really reflect on. I think sometimes people think this idea of a mission is like, oh, I'll just pluck something out of thin air and then I'll take that on as my own. And what I talk a lot about in the book is this idea of actually not making this a theoretical exercise, but looking at your lived experience, right? The places and the context that you have chosen to invest your time, your talents, your efforts, even from a very, very young age. And when we look back and look at those patterns, right? Those elements and those contexts in which we really come alive and we thrive and we're, sort of firing on all cylinders or feeling a bit more in our flow versus those times when we are the opposite, right? Feeling a bit more sluggish, like everything's really difficult. And look what those patterns tell you. And so by looking back at those things, and it's not just about where you've chosen to spend your time and your efforts. It's also about, what do you know that you're really good at? What do people constantly come to you for, even if it's not your official job role or your title or your degree? And it's looking at all of the data of your life, right? The rich data of your life, and then seeing, well, what is this telling me? Maybe it's pointing you in something that you had never really uncovered, or maybe it's something that you sort of had an instinct about, but you never really made it concrete for yourself. But by looking at the data, analyzing the data of your life, all of the elements of it, it can help point to that mission. And for me, from a very early age, what that looked like was helping other people with my own insights, my own advice, my own expertise in so many different contexts. So, growing up, I was always that child who was the sort of the agony aunt, right? People coming to me and asking me for advice and unbearing bearing their souls. Total strangers at bus stops would, sort of, I don't know what it was about me. It wasn't that I was putting anything out there. It just seemed to be that's how the world responded to me. And I also found I loved the problem solving. I loved developing expertise and then using it to help others. And that's followed me throughout my formal career. And so for me, my mission really is, at its most core, is about helping other people using maybe unconventional insights or helping them see things from a different perspective that they haven't seen before.
And Rupal, what was your earliest memory? Because sometimes I think the earliest memory gives us a sense of that. I'm putting you on the spot, I know, but do you have that data?
I don't know if this is my earliest memory. It's definitely from when I was young. There's like a lot of, I guess, vague memories from around the age of like 4 and 5. And
Mm-hmm.
what those memories are of a lot of people. I grew up in an extended family where it's me and my parents plus 3 siblings, plus our grandparents lived with us, plus at any given moment in time we were had aunts, uncles, relatives, cousins living with us. So I just remember there always being people and not really having my own space and not having and just sort of feeling lost in and amidst all of the busyness. And I think, again, with the benefit of trying to go and reflect back on that experience, I think what it did is that a couple of things. One, it gave me a really deep need for alone time, for just purely being on my own, having my own space. Even now, like no matter what it is that I'm doing, I have a very public facing life, but I need to craft and build in that time where it's literally just being by myself or going for a walk and not being around people and not being around all that busyness. And then I think the other thing that helped me develop, which is again an attention to detail. I felt so, and many times in my life, just so overwhelmed by all of the stimuli. And so I wasn't throwing myself into the thick of it. I was sort of on the outsides and intentionally, maybe for sort of self-protective reasons, right? Was just watching what was going on, paying attention to the dynamics, seeing what's going on between who, and just the bigger context. And I think that ability to be very, very attuned to my surroundings was something that has come from, I think, those early formative times in my life.
And I know that, I did a PhD on marginalisation, and I know that when you come from a background of a group that may be marginalised or isn't the mainstream in a country, in a city, in a neighbourhood, that you can be hypervigilant like that. It's actually the identity that requires that. Was that your experience, do you think? Tell us a little bit about your background, because for people listening rather than watching this.
This is a really interesting way of framing it, because I never really thought about it in that perspective. I really imagined it much more sort of my family experience. But you're right. So I come from an Indian American family. So I was, as you said, sort of very often not the norm in any context in which I grew up, or spent a lot of my young adulthood. And there was, I think I probably was by nature a little bit more hypervigilant, and then, but as you
Yes.
said, sort of being an outsider, so in so many times, in so many ways, it refined and it honed that hypervigilance. And yes, there were many times where there was very overt racism, right? I remember one of my earliest, most sort of non-positive memories was being in a car with my mom, and she's an Indian immigrant, she has an accent, she looks brown, and a man crashed into her and then proceeded to get out of the car and shout through the window while it's her and me and my sister in the back about, go back to your own country. This is not how we do things. Those kinds of incidents
Oh, I'm
were
so
sort
sorry.
of regular punctuations in my childhood experience, for sure. And then, as I got older, kids in my class who would ask me, when I learned how to speak English, and this constant sort of othering that
Yes.
I experienced definitely made me just pay more attention to who am I
Mm.
around? What is the vibe here, right? Like, is this a safe place for me? And I think then layered on top of that, being a woman, we have to be
Yes.
hyper vigilant as well, right? So all of the subtleties of our contexts and the worlds in which we inhabit, and how in most cases they really aren't built or for or by or with the interests of women, sort of people of color, et cetera, that makes you a little bit, well, it makes you a lot more vigilant than I think those who don't have one or more of those identities really don't have to in the same way.
Yeah, no, I can see that. And that intersectionality, I love the way you say that the world isn't built for the benefit or interests of people with that intersectionality. And I think that's something that we're dealing with on a daily basis, but in organizations, but also at a national level as well. You wrote your book, but before we go to that, tell me a little bit about, particularly, so I can see that the detailed consciousness and the analysis was a bit of a superpower for you. Was that the superpower that really allowed you to go and be successful in the role you had at CII, or perhaps even in the recruitment of that? Tell me a little bit about, before you were there, what was the recruitment like? What was your thinking about in terms of that role?
Yeah, so it wasn't a role that I had ever considered. It wasn't like this was my life's ambition and then I was making it happen. I was, as you said, I was recruited to join the CIA, and it was a total sort of out of left field kind of invitation, right? Prior to that, what I thought my career was going to look like was either in academia, as a lawyer. I was going to, potentially go to law school, or as a diplomat. And so I think when the CIA approached me, it was such an intriguing invitation that I just sort of, I said yes, but let's talk more. And then as I learned more and more about what the role would entail, it's sort of what you identified just there is, it seemed like it would be a really natural fit for this analytical bent of mind, my curiosity about the world and how things work, that this desire to understand things at their fundamental levels, and the complex interplay between things, and all of the big picture of US foreign policy and culture and all of the things. It just seemed like an ideal fit, but it was not one that I had self-selected into necessarily, right? It was one perhaps that I think, maybe being of an immigrant background, speaking multiple languages, my experience living and working in different countries, I would imagine made me an attractive candidate. But to this day, I have no idea if that's what it was that sort of stood me out.
And then of course you land in that organization. Tell me a little bit about what that was like. What was it in the early days? Particularly as you were looking at the culture of the agency, perhaps, or the ways in which, work was done there? Were there any surprises there? Was it what you were expecting?
Yeah, I went in as a blank slate, to be honest, because again, I had no way to even hazard a guess as to what it would be like. Because, of course, my assumptions were that what you see in pop culture was probably not, accurately reflected in reality. And so when I got there, it was more just being a sponge and absorbing as much as I possibly could about the culture, the way things are done, and being, I think, as most people are, when you start any first job, it's just paying attention to all of the subtle and more overt ways of doing things. What does success look like? And what are the expectations? Asking really good questions, finding mentors, all of that stuff. And so I think it was just this onslaught of stimuli. And then the great thing, of course, is that they do have a formal onboarding program. And so you go through structured sort of, well, this is how we do this, and this is what to think about with this, and this is, all of the big picture, and then the nitty gritty of the jobs. It really was kind of like going back to school in a way, right? Just learning a whole new way of operating in this very specific context.
And in some ways, you went from there. You had a successful career there, and and then you're out of there. Tell us a little bit about what happened. What was the arc for you? And perhaps was it a shift in mission, or was it something else for you?
Yeah, I think for me, it was the time I spent there was probably the most fulfilling times of my life. And it was because there was this bigger sense of mission, this wonderful camaraderie. I was working with some brilliant, I mean, probably some of the smartest people I will ever meet in my life. But it was also a really intense environment. And the stakes of what we were involved in were so, so high. And over time, I did not have this language back then, but I think, again, with the benefit of hindsight, looking back, when I decided to leave, I just thought I needed a change. I just thought that, it was time to try something new, test myself in a different way, maybe take a break for a while. But what I think had happened is I think I burnt out.
Mm.
And I didn't know, I didn't have that vocabulary at the time, and so I was just paying attention, again, paying attention now to myself, right? Like, things are just feeling a little bit harder. They're feeling a little bit less like I'm in my day to day flow and all of these things. And so there was no big aha moment. There was no big pull of like, oh, I really want to do that. It was more just over time, just keeping my eyes open, thinking about, if I did decide to leave, what would that look like? If I decided to stay, how could I, sort of refresh and recharge my career there? And then the one thing that I knew I did want to do was live in London. And so I started to find ways to be a bit more targeted and finding ways to come and live in London. But that was how it happened. I would say it was like a slow, not slow and steady. There were sort of peaks and troughs, but it was like a slow process. And finally, I just thought, you know what, I need to give myself this time. And so I left in 2011.
And what was the period that you gave yourself? Did you go straight into a role, or did you give yourself some time
Yeah,
after
I
that?
so I didn't go straight into a role. My soft landing was to get an MBA because I thought, okay, well, I've worked in this really specific environment for, this large part my entire career, basically up to that point. And so if I'm transitioning into perhaps maybe the private sector, this would be a useful skill set to have. And I knew that also having that 2 year break would give me the time and the headspace to just explore a bit more, right? And see what my options are and see what else is out there. That was how I transitioned out. There wasn't, a role waiting for me. I was just really going back into sort of what we talked about in the beginning, that
Mm,
curiosity phase, that
yeah.
exploratory phase, that understanding where do I want to take my time, my talents, all of these things next.
Mm. And some people might not think of an MBA as time out. I know it's can be a bit intensive, but I can see how you spent that time because, and I'm really glad that you listened to that, and it feels like you intuitively, but you would probably see it as you're getting the signs from the data, from the inputs and the outputs, because many people stay in a situation where they are burnt out and they don't leave and they don't change, and then they get to a point where burnout is very difficult to really bounce back. I mean, the whole idea with burnout is you don't bounce back from it very quickly because you're really depleting all your resources. So I'm really glad you took that moment and you took that time. It's a really important pivot point for you, I imagine.
For sure. And I think, again, I think about the big decision points and the big turning points, even if it wasn't like a sudden thing, if it was a
Mm,
progressive thing, it is for all of us about paying attention and tuning into that. I sometimes say, I was like, anxiety is nature's way of making us decide, right? When you are feeling anxious or
yes.
uncertain or overwhelmed on a consistent basis, not just a one-off, right? Life goes through all kinds of roller coaster waves, but if there is something where you are just regularly not yourself, right? I think that's the
Yes.
other thing, is understanding what is your baseline. And then this deviation from the baseline, if it is a sustained deviation, that's a hugely rich source of data. And for so many people, that manifests as anxiety, as depression, feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, all of these clinical things that we talk about. And so you I think the thing that we are not trained to do is to listen to our bodies, is to pay attention to those feelings that seem like, oh,
Yes.
that's all soft and you just got to power through and suck it up and grow a pair. Language we're used to being around. That's not how it works, right? Like,
No,
if you don't deal with this problem, your body will find a way to physically manifest it. And
exactly.
and and you would know probably better than most, so much data, again, data, right, that shows like people who get heart conditions,
Yes.
ulcers, all of these physical things that we think are somehow separate from our life experience. They're not. We can make ourselves sick. We often make ourselves sick. And so we owe it to ourselves to say, fine, maybe I'm not leaving this job, but how can I shift some of the responsibilities, or can I reshape it in a way that is a bit more fulfilling? We are not victims, most of us, right? Especially, I imagine people listening to this and watching this podcast,
Yes.
we have a lot more agency
Yes.
than we let ourselves realize and act upon. And so listen to those signs. It doesn't need to be a wholesale makeover of your life and your career, but you have to do something.
And I like, yeah, I think that those small steps are really important, and also acknowledging that it's not normal. It's not
Yeah.
normal to wake up with dread, or be so fatigued on the week, because often people are functional Monday to Friday, and then they're so fatigued on the weekend, or they're not able to really enjoy life, outside of work. I think that they're real warning signs.
Yeah.
So you do your MBA, and then what happens? You've completed your
Yeah.
MBA. I'm sure you would have done exceptionally well in your MBA, and then what?
Well, I have a little asterisk there. And when you said about doing exceptionally well, because I think we have this illusion that people have this like straight line journey from one thing to another to another.
Mm,
And so often, when I'm sharing my story, people are like, wow, you did that. And then you did that. I will just give you a small snippet. When did my MBA, I wasn't exceptional. It was overwhelming. It was totally new to me. For the first time in my life, I failed a course. And I remember, I've never failed. I've always been an A+ student my entire life, right? Like, school is what I do. And it was such a beautiful, if a really small lesson in, I
mm,
didn't die, right? The world didn't open up and swallow me whole. Nothing changed. There wasn't like this cataclysmic clash of planets, or it was one class. I got to resit the exam and then I passed, right? And
yeah.
before that, because I had gotten so used to just being good, 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 it would have devastated me, right? To
Mm,
this idea that like I wasn't perfect in some way, that I didn't do I didn't get the A+. It's not a big deal, right? Life happens. And it was such an important, bigger sort of metaphor for like, it's just one data point, right? You can make it mean as much or as little as you like. It is not a reflection of really anything other than your performance on that one day. And so, all of this to say, I think the bigger picture lesson for me is, even now when I struggle with like, oh, that didn't go as well as I wanted, or this was less than perfect in the way I imagined, that's just what it is, right? That's just life.
it is just what it is.
You just got to keep going, figure out a
That's
way
right.
forward. It doesn't have to stop you. It doesn't have to mean anything beyond just that
Mm-mm.
one instant.
Yeah.
So going back to your question, which was around, what then? I used those 2 years to really do what I shared about exploring and putting myself in lots of different contexts. I explored consulting, I explored startup world, I did a lot of different things. And I think you put it earlier, and I talk a lot about it in the book, about mini experiments. And I realized very quickly I didn't want to go back into another structured, big, bureaucratic corporate structure. I wanted the freedom, the agility, and the flexibility of a startup culture. And so I thought initially I would work at a startup. And again, did many different projects and part-time roles. And I was like, actually, why don't I do my own thing, right? Because like I am fiercely independent in a lot of ways,
Yes.
and don't like other people dictating, for example, what success looks like or what I can and can't do, and sort of putting me in a box. And so tried lots of different ideas, settled on one to then just take forward. Again, for those of you who are watching and listening who are ideas people, it's great to have ideas, but you actually have to execute on one, right? It doesn't mean you have to
Yes.
forget about all of the other ones. You got to start with one, make a
Yes.
success of that, and then you can add others later if you want to. And that's exactly what I did. So I started a real estate business. And I knew even in those earliest days that this wasn't it, right? Like it was interesting, it was filling, it was so different to what I was doing. I
Completely
loved
different.
creativity, but I always knew that like this isn't what I'm going to be doing for the next 50 years of my life, right? I will in some way, of course. You don't just start a business and then, sort of ditch it kind of thing. But it was always keeping my eyes open for what next, right? Having that portfolio career, whatever you
Yes.
want to call it. It was constantly doing some of the things that we talked about, right? Building, growing, focusing, but also paying attention. What do I need? Where am I adding value? What is my unique skill set? All of these things. And then finding other ways to build in that stuff to the day-to-day work to just keep it a bit more fresh and interesting for me, so I didn't lose that energy and lose that excitement of what I was doing. And it didn't have to come from work, right? I very
Yes.
quickly learned that we can have all of our emotional needs met, but they don't have to come from one place. They don't have to come just from our relationships or just from our work. We can cobble them together. And that's how it looked for me. I got certain types of fulfillment from my startup and from my business in those early days. And then other types of fulfillment that would never give me, I got from my creative work and from writing and
Yes.
just doing something for its own sake. So that was what that, I would say, slightly meandering journey looked like.
And when did you get the idea for the book? Did that come much later?
It was sort of co-evolved in fits and starts with lots, that transition out of business school into my starting my own companies. Because as I said, I was those first few years of building something from scratch are so difficult,
Yes.
so lonely. And
Yeah.
I really struggled with some of the tedium, the boredom, the lack of
Yes.
like just, the doing of the doing it's not as
You're
sexy as
because you
people
are
think.
everything.
Right. And it was this, and not even a friend. I had lunch with somebody who I had met at a networking event, and he gave me the best advice of my life. He said, Rupal, if you're finding it really hard, why don't you write about it? You said you miss writing, you love to write. Why don't you write about it? And I thought, what great advice, which
That's
I
good
then didn't
advice.
take. I didn't take it for another couple of years. I was like, no, I
Yeah,
don't have time. That's a luxury. I need to focus on
that's
building this
right.
thing. And then finally, I was like, you know what? I need to do this for my spirit, my soul, for my sanity. And so I did for myself. I just started capturing some of the lessons, some of the insights, some of the frustrations, that journey for myself in written form. And I loved it. I loved being able to process that experience and put it into words. And it grew from that, just a very almost like a journal, into then sort of a blog, and then into a newsletter. And then all of the work that I was doing while I was scaling that business also sort of pulled me into other people's orbits, because they'd say, can you help me with this? Or do you have some advice about that? And initially it was just other founders. And then it started to evolve to other people, other leaders in established companies, because all of the foundational stuff is exactly the same, right? It does not
It is.
matter where you're at. And the questions I was getting and the advice that, again, right, going back to like that sort of agony aunt, the advice that I was being asked to give or weigh in on it, I thought, wow, there are some real, again, patterns here around what people are struggling with on the bigger picture of life. And so I started weaving in more of the life lessons stuff
Yes.
into my newsletter. And then finally, I got to a point where, because I've always wanted to write a book ever since I was a child, books have always been so much to me. And it was a life ambition. And then finally it got to a point where I was like, well, I want to write a book. I'm being asked to do, people are asking me for advice on very similar things in different contexts, but similar.
Yes, yeah.
And I'm doing this newsletter. Like, why not make it something bigger? Make it
Mm-mm.
something that others can access who don't know me, right? Who can't just pick up a phone or send me a text and be like, hey, do you have 5 minutes? And so that's how
Exactly.
it came about. It was an evolution of, I would say, probably 5 or 6 years of thought, of
Right.
writing, of reflection, and
Yeah.
then it was crystallized in this book because the pain of not writing it was greater than the pain of sitting it down to actually to write it.
Right. And it is a mega task writing a book. People
Yep.
I think don't understand that if they're not writers or they haven't. There's, to your point in terms of the perfectionism that maybe you had through your early years, that comes in. You really need support because there's a sense that you're putting your words out there and then you don't have any control about what happens to those words. Who supported you in that process,
Yeah.
particularly during that time?
I had a really brilliant book coach. And because as I said, it was like 5 or 6 years in the making. And what was the biggest hurdle for me was I have this universe of ideas and insights that I think are going to help people. They're interesting, they're insightful, they're inspiring. How do I whittle that down into a coherent
That's
whole?
right.
Right? And so I hired a book coach, and she was absolutely brilliant at giving me very specific task oriented things to help break some of that inertia. Because for me, that's what it looked like. Is like, I want to say everything, but I can't, so I'm going to say nothing. Right. And so it was like, how do I get over that hurdle? And so she did. She gave me both the focused sort of directive tasks to help break it down, but also the accountability. I needed the external accountability of somebody else being like, okay, by next week, I want you to have done this analysis by the week after that. And so working with her was brilliant because it got me to a point where once I had done the work that she had assigned and I had gotten to a table of contents, we didn't do any writing together. We got to a
Right.
table of contents. And that was the most freeing part. And then I just flew. Like, it really was so easy after that to fill in each chapter with the words and the ideas and the insights
Yes.
because now I had the structure. So she
Mm.
was probably the biggest support. And then there were so many other like individuals who supported me along the way, who opened doors, who made introductions. But yeah, I would say that relationship was probably the most pivotal because it got the book done and it was exactly what I needed.
And I think, that's a lesson as well. It's that when you get clear, and sometimes it helps to have some external input into that because sometimes we get so lost in our own, mesh. There's a
Yep.
lot of mesh and muck in there. And so getting clear, then you get back into flow.
Yes.
Who is your book written for?
Hmm. I love and I hate that question because the short answer is it's written for everyone. Actually, I will leave it at that. It is written for everyone. And the reason I hate that question because it's not a very good marketing answer, right? I remember the publisher being like, "So what's the demographic? Who are we going to sell this to? Is it, CEOs? Is it women? Is it entrepreneurs?" I was like, "Yes, yes, yes,
Yes,
yes," right?
yes, yeah.
And so that's why I hate this question. But it is genuinely for everyone. And it's for because the sort of the giveaway is in the subtitle, right? Conventional life lessons. Every single one of
Yes.
us is lifing right now.
Mm-mm.
Some of the examples I have and the case studies I weave into it and the insights are drawn, of course, from my career in the CIA and becoming a CEO, but also from my experiences as a parent, my experiences as a sibling, my experiences as a daughter of immigrants. Like, we are all such matrixed people, right? We're not just one isolated anything. And I think that for me was part of what I wanted to role model in the book is we are all complex. We all have various, what I refer to as sort of streams of intel feeding into who we are and how we show up. And so this book is really meant for those who want to live their own lives, to lead their own lives and sort of question some of the assumptions that may have been weighing them down around, well, I can't do this, or that's not possible for me. And as the subtitle promises, to get them to think bigger, lead better, and be bolder in tangible, meaningful ways, whatever is tangible and whatever is meaningful for them. So yeah, I sort of joked, I did a TV interview last year and I was like, it's for anyone from 19 to 99, right? It's sort of like the
Of
Trivial
course.
Pursuit of books.
Exactly, of course. And tell me a little bit about your particular philosophy around leading, because right now, particularly, we were talking about this before, particularly in the geopolitical stage, we are seeing some very templated versions of leadership that perhaps we haven't seen before. What's your take on what good leadership is, or perhaps what it isn't?
Gosh, I think we need a whole extra 2 hours for this
We
conversation.
do.
But very simply for me, leadership is about ownership. It's about identifying a problem, owning that you are going to do something about it, and then also owning the repercussions of that. So it's the full life cycle, right? It's not just saying, okay, I'm going to do that and then I'm not going to have to think about it. Many leaders, as we are now seeing, behave in that way, right? They say or do pretty damning and destructive things, but don't really think about the repercussions, don't
Yes.
really own what those repercussions are, not just for them, of course, but for everybody else who's affected, right? I think that's a really lazy way to lead. It's just like, oh, well, it's a very old fashioned sort of dictatorial, my way or the highway, like I'm above the rest. There's me as the
Mm-hmm.
leader, and then there's all of you minions doing the bidding, right?
Yes.
That to me is not leadership. That's authoritarianism. That's dictatorship. That's not leadership. So fundamentally, it's about that, like I said, that cycle of what is the problem? What am I going to do about it? And how am I going to own whatever happens, good or bad? The other thing that I think I'm seeing a lot of, and this is politics, this is corporate culture, this is across the board. And this is also in the work that I do now, where I'm a leadership consultant. I go into companies and I help them with these big leadership problems, is a strange sense of helplessness from the people who have authority, budget, title, all of these things, but they are waiting for somebody else to tell them what to do.
Yeah.
And again, if you're a leader, my sort of tough love message in those contexts is act like a leader, right? You have an ability to and a responsibility to not just follow the masses, to do what is right for your people, for your organization, all of these things. You don't have to pledge loyalty to things just because everybody else is doing it. And I think so many leaders, especially now it seems, are doing what probably they perceive as expedient, right?
Yes.
If I do this, then it'll get me some influence. If I do this, it'll gain me market share. Again, being sort of very aware of repercussions, what does that play that out to the end, right? If you're constantly responding to external stimuli, if you're constantly making accommodations for expedience's sake, when does that stop, right? Then what are you actually a leader, or are you just being dictated to by somebody else? And I think
Yes.
that has been the big question for me, is like, okay, fine, all of those who are making these sort of various, like I said, short-termist expedient deals, then what, right? And then where does that train end up? And what are you left with at the end for you as a person, but also as an organization? Where's your autonomy, right? Where's your independence? Where's all of those things that leaders are supposed to exhibit, but also I would have thought right? You want autonomy. You want an ability to dictate the terms of what your organization does, and not in isolation. Obviously, there are laws and rules and all of those things. But
Yes.
it's really confusing to me. I'm just seeing so many leaders not acknowledging or acting like they are leaders.
Mm.
And I genuinely just don't understand it. Because if anybody has an ability to have influence and impact, it's them. They've got the resources, they've got the title, they've
Yes.
got the access. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's
And is the opposite of that really understanding what you stand for and then really standing in that? Because, again, I think it's part of mission and purpose that you understand how your leadership is a vehicle to serving not just yourself, but the organization or the larger ecosystem or the larger market. It might be industry, it might be nation, whatever that is.
yeah, for sure. And I think it's a couple of things. It's about, yes, as you said, understanding your purpose and your mission, but also being very clear, because there are so many ways to serve any end goal, any mission,
Yes.
any whatever, right? So you as an individual have to be crystal clear about what are the trade-offs you are willing to make, right? What are your red lines? What are some of the things that
Yes.
you are absolutely, it doesn't matter if it's going to give you like the competitive advantage for the next 700 years. You're just not going to do that thing, right? What are those? And I think so many leaders, and this is true in every context, there's so much reactive leadership. There's so much ad hoc leadership. And, I have a foreign policy background, and I remember Henry Kissinger quite famously saying, America needs a foreign policy strategy, as opposed to what his perception at the time, and I think he was largely right, was, we're just reacting to events.
Yes,
we're not
yes.
shaping things. We don't have a big plan. We're just reacting. And there's so many leaders who are constantly just reacting to the context around them, instead of, as we've been talking about, having that very clear vision of like, you know what? Actually, this is the long play, right? I'm not going to make these sort of trade-offs now. I'm not going to make these accommodations, even if in the short term it leads to a dip in whatever, economic performance, customer base, whatever, doesn't matter. This is the long-term vision. And I think that's okay, because I think part of the problem with the way corporate cultures and leadership in general has been formulated is it's seen as zero sum, right? Holding a little bit back. If I am not going full guns blazing and willing to make all of the accommodations and exceptions in the service of that bigger goal, then somebody else is going to win out, right? So if whatever I am losing, somebody else is going to have. And I think that's such a adolescent way of viewing the world, right? That's not reality. There's never just one winner. In sports there are, but I mean, in the rest of life, it's a lot. There's room for a lot more. And that sort of zero sum mentality is really, really destructive, because it makes people then think they have to make those short-term accommodations or those so-called expedient choices, when the reality is you probably don't, right?
Yes.
Actually, I will put a line in this, put a line there and say, you don't, right? You can take a long-term view.
Exactly.
And you don't have to make those trade-offs if you focus on, as you started out the question on, focusing on the mission. What is the bigger mission? What is the purpose we are serving? And that can take many, many, many different forms.
And when I think about the great leaders that I've seen and the great CEOs that I've witnessed, they are those people that do have the long form in terms of their thinking, but can communicate that. So there might be some things that are happening short term that may not be popular, but they're communicating that in relation to the longer term strategy, and they have that it's like an artistry around how they communicate. So they're bringing everyone along with.
Yes. And that's one of the things that as you were saying that, I thought is such an important additional point is, again, that model of the past of like hierarchy, dictatorship, et cetera, of leadership, that doesn't require communication, right? The only communication is the order. I say this, you do that. But most of us, I would, again, hazard a guess to say all of us, don't really respond well to that, right? And any one of us who thinks about good leaders, transformational leaders, will identify exactly that. They're not lying about what's going on. They're transparent, they're honest, and they communicate. And they recognize that the people who are part of their organization are on the journey with them. They're not obstacles to that journey. They're not things that have to be dealt with. They are on it together. It's a shared mission. And that communication is so critical of, this is why we're on the ride, and this is what we're doing. And this is, as you said, this is why things are a little bit difficult now. Just communicating authentically, honestly, and recognizing that communication is part of your job. It's not an annoying side effect, right? It is part of your job.
That's right.
Those leaders, as you said, those transformational, really inspiring leaders understand that instinctively.
Exactly. Rupal, going back to maybe the last part of your subtitle, which is being bolder.
Yeah.
I know in your book you talk about sort of, being who you already are, but in the most powerful way possible. And I love that, because for me, power is an engine, and we can use it, for for good or for evil, but we can also perhaps not see it as a resource. How do you define power in that context, and how do you see, what are maybe some of the hacks that you see could work for people and that you share in the book? Because I know you actually share some really cool hacks in the book as well, the small things you can do to change things. How could I be the most powerful version of myself?
Yeah, gosh. So there's two elements to that. There's who you are and understanding, and that's why so much of my book focuses on self-awareness and self-analysis. Is like, what are your superpowers? What are those strengths? What are those things that you are just uniquely qualified to do? It doesn't mean nobody else can do it. It means but these are your unique combination of skills. And then also, what is the context? Because we all have so many things in our skill set, in our toolkit, that aren't relevant in every context. And so it's about paying attention to both, so that given the requirements of any context, you can then choose from this toolkit that you have and say, okay, well, this, and this are the things that are going to be the most relevant, the most useful, and the most impactful. And these other things doesn't mean I don't have them, if I need them. It's just I don't need to turn them on as much or bring them to the party if I'm operating in this context. And I think it's that, again, that sensitivity to both yourself, but also your surroundings, that helps you tap into that power, because we're not all just unidimensional automatons who only have one setting, right? We do this naturally, where we dial up certain traits and attributes in some situations and dial them down in others, and vice versa. And so let's be thoughtful about that, so that we then do have the best ability to go into any context with the right combination of tools. And so a very simple example I gave in the book is, when I was serving in an active war zone, I couldn't show up to these meetings with the general where it's around, and some of these sort of like bases that are, 5, 6 people maximum, right? I'm not going to show up in my suit and heels. That's totally irrelevant for that context. And it sounds so superficial, because it is superficial, but that's the reality. That's one element, right? That's one of those things in your sort of toolkit, is how you physically show up. And so I could have, right? I could have very well. And I know colleagues who did and then were not taken seriously because it didn't fit in that context, right? Didn't mean that I was like trying to be a man and like grow a beard or anything like that. It just meant, yeah, I'm going to wear my cargo pants and my sweatshirt, right? That's the appropriate sort of way to show up in that context. It just lowered the hurdle of acceptance and of credibility that much, little bit, right? Similarly, little things like how your posture, making eye contact with people, having a firm handshake, all of these things sort of we as human beings, we see and feel and perceive subtly and subconsciously, but they all make it a little bit easier or a little bit harder for us to be, like I said, taken seriously, seen as credible. And that is also a part of your power, right? You have the power to control how you show up in those ways, superficially, internally, how you prepare, all of those things. So be very thoughtful and intentional about, this is what I've got, this is where I am, what's that combination that's going to work here, and then deliver on that, right? It's not just like, authenticity isn't just about showing up the same all the time, right? I think people have this idea that like, oh, well, if I'm in this context, then no, authenticity is dialing up and dialing down based on who you are, of course, but what the job requires. And so that is, for me, is power, is tuning into your unique skill set, those unique combinations of tools and attributes, and then doing the work to see how is it going to fit and how can I give myself the best chance to fit in this specific context.
You're right, it does require high self-awareness as well as self-regulation, because there might be some default behaviors or default reactions that you need to dial down as well. It's not always going to be those things that come up at a conscious level. For example, I might be someone who's like a bull out of a gate most of the time. And maybe when I'm feeling a bit uncertain or anxious, I'm even more that, but that's not appropriate for the context. People aren't going to see that as a power move from me. They're going to be a bit taken aback. Is that the kind of things you're talking about there?
Exactly. I mean, that's read the room, right? I think, and so many people don't. They just think, well, I've got this thing to say and I'm going to do this thing and this is what I was called in to do. That's fine, right? If your only if the only intention was to go in and do the thing. But On the flip side, if your intention was to go in and do the thing successfully, or go in and do the thing in the way that resonated, or go in and do the thing in a way that was received, then you have to be a bit more thoughtful. And as you said, pull back instead of being that bull in the china shop saying, okay, well, in this context, I'm going to hold back. I'm going to see what else other people are saying, and then I will make my contribution, or whatever it looks like, right? But it's not, there's no cookie cutter like, okay, well, I'm just going to hit play and then just go off and do this thing, right? In real time, you have to also make that decision. So you can do all the prep work, right? All the thought, all the intentionality, how are you going to show up? How are you going to prepare? How are you going to deliver? And then you go in and maybe the context changes and you have to be willing to change with it. So that takes practice, that takes effort. It takes a lot of practice. I wish there was something that I could say, well, just do these three things. It's not, it's every situation is different, but the more, uh, the more opportunity give yourself to do those things, to pay attention, to do the preparation, all of that stuff, then you have an arsenal that you can rely on and be a bit more agile in any given context if things go totally different to what you had planned for.
Absolutely. That's great. And it feels like it's easy, but it's not. I agree with you. It requires practice. Working with a coach is a really good way of practicing that too in a safe environment. There are some other techniques that you have in the book. There's so many. I can't go over all of them, but one of the techniques I particularly really like, because I use this with teams actually, is the after action review. Can you tell me a little bit about how you have used that technique, or perhaps what it is first for people that don't know how you've used it and why it's one of those techniques that you see as powerful as well?
Yeah, I think it just gives us more information. And so, so many people, we're just constantly doing, right? We're just going from one thing to another, to another, to another. We're constantly in execution mode. And that is important. We need to execute, but we also need to reflect on and learn from what worked and what didn't. And so, as you said, in any context, and you can do this for yourself, and I'll give you an example of how you can do this for yourself, but anything that is important to your organization, to your team, to yourself, requires some of that after action review. And what that looks like is, okay, well, we've just rolled out this new strategy, or we've just launched this new product, or we've just started this new onboarding process, whatever the specifics are. Now that it's in motion, now that we're getting some live feedback from how it's actually working and being received, what are we doing, right? What is working? What is not working? What are some of those bottlenecks? What was really painful in this experience? What would we do differently the next time? So capturing all of the lessons, even if it's successful, sometimes especially if it's successful, right? If people, something goes really, really well, then people just take it for granted that it'll always go well. Well, no, you can identify what were those conditions and then try to replicate them for next time instead of taking for granted that they will just somehow magically appear next time. And the same is true for us as individuals. My sort of after action review for individuals, what it can look like is capturing what your year looked like, right? So many people, especially at the beginning of a new year, are so focused on like, oh, well, this is what this year is going to bring. These are my plans. What did your last year look like, right?
Yeah.
What is your after action review of the year that just finished? What are some of the things you don't want to replicate? What are some of the hard lessons you learned? What are some of the wonderful things that you want to do more of? All of this stuff, right? I don't want to overly sort of focus on data, but the data is important, right? And it doesn't, the beauty about data is that it can tell us a lot of things that maybe we would have taken for granted. It doesn't tell us everything, right? It doesn't necessarily help us predict the future. And just because it worked that one time doesn't mean it will always work. But at least you then have a bit of a better instinct about what, like your instincts are informed, right? It's not just like blind intuition. It's based on the data, based on the experience, based on the analysis. So I think there's such a beautiful opportunity to come together and identify, as we just said, what is working, what isn't, and how can we try to create the conditions as best as we possibly can to make it more likely that the good stuff will happen and less likely that the bad stuff will happen.
Exactly. And wouldn't it be lovely for us to do that with our relationships too? You can apply it anywhere. I love it. Very simple. Very simple. Rupal, we are running out of time very quickly. We've probably gone over time, but I could keep talking to you. I wanted to, it's been such a great conversation. I wanted to just finish with your 3 ideals, because I really love the 3 ideals. So perhaps you can explain your 3 ideals. And my question to you is, are you living them right now? And maybe that's another conversation, but just, in a nutshell.
So the idea of the three ideals, so it's your ideal day, your ideal life, and your ideal legacy. And the idea is to look at the big picture, right? And see what, again, sort of blue sky thinking, right? If everything were possible, what would I'll start with the smallest one. What would your ideal day look like? How would you be managing those, I don't know, roughly 16 hours that you're awake, right? Between all of the competing roles and
Mm-hmm.
responsibilities you have in an ideal, right? We're just starting with the big picture stuff. And then at the very opposite extreme of that is, not just the micro of the day, but at the very end of your life, what is the legacy, right? What is that
Mm,
thing that you want to have left behind for yourself, for your family, for your world, for your community, whatever it looks like. And then looking at what all of those ideals first and foremost are pointing to, right? What does it say? Like if you are in full control of what those ideals are, because you get to define them. What are those saying about your values, what's important to you? And then where is there any skew in between the
yeah.
ideal and the reality? And what then can you do to bridge the gap between the ideal and the reality? It doesn't mean that you will be able to bridge all of the gaps. It doesn't mean
Yeah.
you'll be able to do it overnight, even in the next year. But again, it's that thoughtfulness and that awareness of, okay, well, this is where I'm at now. This is where I would love to go. What can I do as a human being who has agency, has access, has some privilege, even, we all, again, the fact that we can listen to and watch podcasts is a privilege over what,
Exactly.
right? Like, so based
Absolutely.
on who you are, where you're at, what you've got,
Yeah.
what can you do to bridge that gap? And work consistently towards bridging that gap. And then more fundamentally, while we are doing that work to bridge that gap, how can we bring some of that ideal into our lives now? Because we
Yes.
often say, oh, well, when the kids are out of the house, or when I get that next promotion, or when the mortgage is paid off. And we delay these things that are really important to us. And so, all I would encourage folks to do through this exercise is, well, what small snippet of that ideal can you bring into your everyday? One of the most sort of harrowing lines I ever heard was, and it stayed with me, is how you live your days is how you live your life. And of course, that's
Mm,
fundamentally
of
true. Like
course.
that is so
Yeah.
self-evident, but it's quite philosophical when you think about it. So instead of pushing everything off to some when in the future that may or may not arrive, by the way, right? You may never pay off the mortgage. Your kids may never leave the house, right? Like we just don't know. And so what can you do to build that into your today?
Yes.
For
Yeah.
me, one of my ideals of my ideal day and also my ideal legacy was writing, right? So I find ways to build, even if it's just 20 minutes every day of writing into my life. For you or other people, maybe it's music. Maybe it's just before you start the rush hour commute, you just play piano for 30 minutes. It doesn't have to be this big transformation, this big all or nothing. It's just what's very practical, what's doable, and what is going to give some of that spark back to you, right? That motivation, that excitement that you might have just sort of let drop by in the day-to-day routine of everything that you're doing. So those ideals will help you maybe reset sort of your compass and help you see where you need to be weaving some more of that stuff back into your every single day.
Yeah. I love that. I love that it's a work in progress.
Yes.
And I think you've given us all a little bit more optimism around that too. Thank you so much. I really appreciated your conversation today.